Got to get my notes out here. Yep, that's right. You know, we left off last night talking about a legacy that David had. And a legacy is such a powerful concept when you think about it. You might think about someone in your own life that left a legacy. Some of us were talking about it at the cafe last night. You might think about a person. When I think about somebody from here, I think about Uncle John, someone that left a lasting legacy. And sometimes people that leave legacies get these titles like David seems to have gotten from God. I'm reading right now The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Any big Narnia fans here? Excellent, good, we're all friends. So I'm reading Narnia to my children right now, and I love that end of that section in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when Aslan, he grants these names to the children, and he says to, when he gives them their titles at Cair Paravel, he says, King Peter. Anybody know what it is? King Peter the Magnificent, King Edmund the Just, High King Susan the Gentle, and of course, little Lucy the Valiant. And when I think about Lucy and I think about David, that's exactly the word that comes to mind for me. It's actually valiant. Valiant. That was what David was like. And there are many people in the Bible that get these kinds of titles. You think about good titles. Think about Daniel. You guys did Daniel for youth conference not too long ago. Daniel, the man greatly beloved, or Abraham, the friend of God. Hezekiah, a root out of dry ground. Jacob, the one who prevails with God. Paul, a light to the Gentiles. Peter, the rock. James, the just or the less or the short, whatever. John the Baptist, Jeremiah the weeping prophet, John the disciple whom Jesus loved, Noah, a herald of righteousness, Joseph, who got renamed Barnabas. Why? Because he was a son of encouragement. But not all these legacies were good. See, David has this beautiful legacy, but we all have a choice. When we think about people, some people leave legacies for bad. And in our very final study, we're going to actually look at that as David became this benchmark in Israel for those who would be what God wanted, the epitome, valiance not only in earthly things, but spiritual valiance that he showed. You think about some people like Cain, who got called the evil one, Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord, David's own nephews, the sons of Zeruiah, who you guys studied in one of your classes because of their severity, James and John, they got called sons of thunder. What is it that you will be remembered for? What is it that in the annals of Christadelphia and Hebron's, what is the legacy that you will leave? And is someone like David going to be inspiring to you to be valiant for the Lord? Will you be like David, a man after God's own heart? A woman after God's own heart? So we often say this, and the real question is this legacy that David had, is this legacy from David something that God actually says? Now turn over to Acts chapter 13 and look at verse 16 and verses 21 to 23. So Acts 13, beginning at verse 16. So Paul and Barnabas stand up and say, Men of Israel, you who fear God, and listen, down to verse 21. Then they asked for a king, and God gave them Saul, the son of Kish, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, for 40 years. And when he had removed him, he raised up David to be their king, of whom he testified and said, I have found in David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, who will do all of my will. And of this man's offspring, God has brought to Israel a Savior, Jesus, as he promised. Notice who found him. It's God, and it's God's legacy. It's God's title that he gave to David. of whom he testified. God had a testimony about this man that he was after his own heart, and he found him. Now, for those Bible students among us here that are trying to figure out where this quote is from, you're not going to find it. There is no actual single quote where God says to David, "You are a man after my own heart." The way that this title is inferred is from, I think, a number of scriptures. I've got some of them on the screen here. And the reason for saying that is because sometimes when we think about a story, the legacy someone leaves is a compilation of their whole life. So when we think about the story of David, and we think about his whole life that you guys have been studying, we think about that story of this hero. This is the culmination of his whole life. So as the chairman said, we're going to think about the end. Start at the end. This is where we're going. But we need to see why. We want to chase this arc and find out why. Where did these characteristics come from? How did God conclude after finding this little boy that he was going to be a man after his own heart? It's an amazing story. And I love the fact that we first meet David in the mind of God. Have a look at 1 Samuel chapter 13 and verse 14. First Samuel 13 at verse 14. Speaking to Saul, "But now your kingdom shall not continue, because the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. And the Lord commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." So this is long before David exists. We haven't met David anywhere in this record, and yet we find him in the mind of God. God was seeking someone after his own heart. He was looking for him, and not only that, just like it had in Acts chapter 13, this says that the Lord has commanded him. The Lord has commanded him, which means that God was operable in raising this young man and bringing him to life. And that's what we want to do really in this first study, is look at how David brought this shepherd boy into his flow channel to bring him into the transformational journey as he became a king. And there's so much material that we can look at. My good friend Josh Wallace gave a study weekend last year, and he said this, that we have more knowledge and insight about David's life than any other in the Old Testament. In the records of Samuel and Chronicles, we have much historical narrative surrounding the events of his life, but in the Psalms, we are given extraordinary insight into his personal thought life. And in our discussion groups after this study, you guys are going to have a chance to do that. Please, young people, enter into the mind of David. Enter into his heart. Try to figure out why the Lord commanded this boy, this little shepherd boy, to be the prince over his people. What was it that God found in him from Acts 13? What was it that he found? Well, young people, I think he found his own heart. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't fully formed. But in that little boy, he saw his own heart. And I hope that's what we get to see. Now let's just talk just for a brief moment about whether this is just a story or not. So just in case, this is the only really archaeological reference that I'm going to make in this series, but I just want to let you guys know, David was a real person. This is not just a story, not that I have to convince you guys, but just so you know more certainly. I was talking to some of you at the cafe last night. I'm an engineer. You guys see that. I want to know. I want everything in detail. I want to solve for the exactitude of what we're talking about here. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I'm just like, is this just a nice story? Just in case you have that thought as well, one brief moment. So the house of David is actually a legitimate archaeological fact. We just think about this inscription at Tel Dan. I'll just quote from the authority that found it. The fragmentary Tel Dan stela containing the Tel Dan inscription, or the House of David inscription, was discovered in 1993 at the site of Tel Dan in northern Israel in an excavation directed by Israeli archaeologist Abraham Biran, and provided the first historical evidence of King David from the Bible. The Armenian king who erected the stela in the middle of the 8th century BC, claims to have defeated the king of Israel and the king of the house of David. So let's just be certain that this is not just a story. This is a real person who really interacted with God and whose life was really transformed from a nothing into everything for Israel. He went from a shepherd to a king. Now, we didn't read David's name in 1 Samuel chapter 13. So I got an open question for you. Unfortunately, because we don't have internet in here, I was going to do one of those Menti things here. So I'm just going to ask it as an open question. Somebody call it out. I'm an interactive communicator here, so you guys better be ready to talk. So where do we first meet David in the Bible? Where do we meet him first? By name. Plausible deniability. Ruth 4. That's exactly right. I did not know that. Guy stole my notes from this morning. You're right. Ruth chapter 4. David is actually Ruth's cliffhanger. It is so incredibly placed in the Bible. It's perfectly placed in the Bible. Ruth chapter 4, verses 18 through 22. Long before we ever get David in the narrative, and even before we get him in the mind of God, we get him in Ruth chapter 4. So flip over to Ruth chapter 4 and just look at the last couple of verses. So Ruth chapter 4. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. Close. Enter 1 Samuel. And we don't hear anything about David for another 15 chapters. This is incredibly important. It's done this way in the narrative for a reason. And Edersheim puts it this way. And so the story which began in poverty, this is Ruth's whole story, poverty and famine and exile, leads up to the throne of David. Undoubtedly, this was the main objective for which it was recorded, to give us the history of David's family with his genealogy, traced not in every link, but in symbolic outline. The book of Ruth appropriately closes. So you get this history here of the judges. Ruth's story is thrown in, cliffhangers with David, and then you get the story and the tragedy of Saul for 15 chapters. So this is important because it's setting up what we looked at last night in our study outline. It's setting up a contrast for Saul as compared to David, the one who was unfit to be king, the one who the people wanted, the people's choice, not God's choice. And we're going to see this set up as a contrast. Why even bother having it in there? Because it wants you to remember the way that the compilers of the Bible have done it. They have put it that way so that we end on David, get a contrast to Saul, before we enter this beautiful story of David. So let's look at the genealogy of the house of David. This is kind of like the life and times segment of the talk before we get to the shepherdy bit. So the point here, just have a look at this genealogy of David just for a moment. Just have a look at this just for a second. These genealogies are complicated. So when you look at the females, you get exactly what Ruth was trying to demonstrate. Ruth, of course, was a Moabite. Rahab, we find out from the beginning of Matthew's gospel, Rahab is a Canaanite. Rahab the harlot. And even a questionable relationship. We do not have time in this series to go through it. But if you even look at David's family and the relationship between Jesse and an unknown wife who goes on later to marry an Ammonite king, Nahash, it's really complicated. David has a messy family. That is the point. Anybody got a messy family? I do. My parents are divorced. My dad is married someone else. My mother was adopted. We've got all sorts of relatives that I don't even know. And I have a very complicated family. A lot of stuff in my extended family is also very complicated. Hey, this is for you. If you got a complicated family, don't give up. Your genealogy might look a little bit strange as well. Well, if it's anything like David's or anything like mine, that's no forecast of what your life is going to be. In fact, it's just the opposite. God is going to use this genealogy as leverage to teach the Gentiles how they can come and be part of God's family. And to me, the thing to memorize this, and again, I'm thinking I got my little kids, he was the first half-blood prince. Legit. David was legit the first half-blood prince. He's the OG, man. I'm just saying. It's just a fact. I didn't make this up. That's what the Bible said. No, anyway. So David, as he comes into life, he comes into the story as a mixed bag. He has a mixed genealogy. He has what people will call a tainted genealogy. But guess what? That is the genealogy that ends in our Lord Jesus Christ. And it's the genealogy into which you can be adopted as well. You see, if you're going to touch God's family, you're asking to be part of a messy family. I love all of you. You're all very beautiful people, but you all have very messy and complicated backgrounds, I'm certain. And when we get to tomorrow morning, I hope that we're all going to feel that way. We have all come in here from whatever mess that we brought, whatever background, whatever baggage that we got, we all brought it in here. The good news is that there's a place for you in the genealogy of Christ. Now let's just think about just timeline-wise, just to get a bit of a view of the timeline here. Just reflecting on this, when I look at the timeline of David's life, he lives about 70 years, or exactly 70 years. When you think about when he's born to Jesse, the tribe of Judah. He's the youngest of 8 children. Then he gets anointed by Samuel, which is where our story really is going to begin today. He, of course, kills Goliath the Philistine. He becomes a musician in Saul's house. And at 30 years old, he is made king of Judah. And that is actually where our study is going to stop. So we're really looking at just this section right here, which means we're looking at David from 15 to 30, which is exactly your age. So some critical moments in his life, when you try to work out how old was he when all of this stuff happens, for anybody who wants to take some notes on this, if you work backwards from 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 4 and 5, when we work backwards from David becoming king at 30, you can work all of this other stuff out. So obviously not going to do that. That's not the purpose of this morning. But just to give you an idea, so David is 15 years old when he's anointed king. He's 20 about when he defeats Goliath. He's about 25 when he's running from Saul. And he's 30 years old when he becomes king at Hebron. All right, so those are some mile markers. Is that helpful? Just to kind of know how old he is. Because I want you guys, I don't know who's at which age here, but I want you guys to think every time we come to David and an encounter, I want you to think, he was my age when he did that. He was my age. Some of us were talking at breakfast this morning about when he goes up. Some people are older than 20 when he defeated Goliath. Some people here, like, he was younger than me. Just let that kind of like sit. He is a young person. When all of these things are happening, he's a young person. And he comes into a really, really unfortunate time in Israel's history. And to illustrate that, I'm just going to play you a short video clip from the Bible miniseries.
Samuel! You are but I am your king. What the Lord gives, he can take away. Are these God's words or yours? Your descendants could have ruled for over 1,000 years. Today, God has forsaken you. More divine words. God has torn your power from you. He wants a man after his own heart. Wine.
Sire.
Do you hear me? Now!
Yes, sire.
Perhaps I've been hasty. I should ask Samuel's forgiveness. Bring Samuel to me.
He's gone, Majesty.
Gone? Samuel!
After Saul's disobedience, God commands his prophet Samuel to find a new king.
Young man! What is your name?
David, sir! My name is David!
I think he's Aussie, I'm pretty sure. What a complicated time for Israel. It's a complicated time for David, obviously, to enter into God's service, but it's a more complicated time for Samuel. Because unfortunately, Samuel is at a situation now where Israel has become disobedient through a disobedient king, and God needs someone new. Turn to 1 Samuel chapter 16, and we're just going to read the first verse. And Yahweh said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go, and I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." Anyone see the link to Acts chapter 13? What's the operative word? Provided. In the providence of God, he provided for himself a king. I have provided for myself, not for Israel, not for Samuel, but for himself. I have provided for myself a king, and in doing so, rejected Saul. Just have a look back at the previous chapter. Look at verses 26 to 29, which you guys saw in that video. Samuel said to Saul, "I will not return to you, for you have rejected the word of Yahweh, and Yahweh has rejected you from being king over Israel." As Samuel turned to go away, Saul seized the skirt of his robe, and it tore. And Samuel said to him, "Yahweh has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this day, and it has been given to a neighbor of yours who is better than you." Two amazing points about this. One, the tearing. It's not just a removing, it's a tearing. It was going to be hard. It was going to hurt. It was going to be painful for Saul. Now, we don't usually have very much pity on Saul, but the next couple of classes, just remember that Saul, he did not want this to happen. He was a divided person, and it was going to be torn from him. And it was given to a neighbor who was better than him. A neighbor who was better than him. This is quite an interesting idea. What do you mean, a better neighbor? Well, how old is David from that genealogy? How old's David about this time? 15. You're telling me a better neighbor than me, the king of Israel? My better neighbor is a 15-year-old shepherd boy? Now, he didn't know that, of course, at this time, but that was what God saw. Remember that. Who's 15 in the room here? God's looking for you guys to be better neighbors than your actual neighbors. He's looking for you guys to be more spiritual, more set apart, separate from your neighbors, someone that's better. At 15, you can do that. You know, at 15, you can be better than the leaders of our own Christadelphian community, some of which have been woeful in their examples to you. You can be the better neighbor than God's actual leaders that have been anointed. Will you make that choice? Will you choose at 15 years old to live the better life, to walk the higher path? And we just don't realize that. David here, he's born to Jesse, and Jesse does not anticipate this at all. David is actually born to Jesse late in life. We get that from 1 Samuel chapter 17, and we get that from verse 12, where it says, "In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years, and the three oldest sons of Jesse were following Saul." And verse 14 says David was the youngest. So Jesse is old and doesn't expect this from his son. And maybe that's like you for your parents. Maybe your parents are not that, maybe they're not seeing what you could become, but God does. Sometimes we have to not think about what even our natural family thinks of us. We have to think about what God can make of us. So Samuel is given this call to go anoint a son to be a king. How does it pan out? We'll look at verses 6 to 13. We know the story leading up to this moment. Samuel comes by. He's going to be making an offering. Everybody's scared. Samuel's coming. What's this story going to be all about? And Samuel begins, he gives zero explanation about this to anyone. Sorry for the cartoons. Everybody's kind of laughing at the cartoons and thought, it's a young people's weekend. So I figured, everybody likes some cartoons. I think this is the last cartoon anyway. So enjoy it while it lasts. So here is how the anointing happens. Now, we're going to read this slow because we're going to hang on every word of this. When they came, he looked at Eliab and thought, surely Yahweh's anointed is before him. But Yahweh said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For Yahweh sees not as a man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but Yahweh looks on the heart. Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, neither has Yahweh chosen this one. Then Jesse made Shammah pass by. And he said, neither has Yahweh chosen this one. And Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, Yahweh has not chosen these. Then Samuel said to Jesse, are all your sons here? And he said, there remains yet the youngest, but behold, he is keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, send and get him, for we will not sit down until he comes here. And he sent and brought him in. Now, he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. And Yahweh said, arise and anoint him, for this is he. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of Yahweh rushed upon David from that day forward. And Samuel rose and went to Ramah. Interesting how our God makes his choice. Doesn't look on the outward appearance, and yet David is described as being a beautiful person, a good-looking person. Some people say that ruddy is like red flushed face. Doesn't necessarily mean he has red hair, but some people might say that he could have looked quite different. He might have been born to a different mother than some of the other sons. He was obviously shorter than the others, and I'm just saying, some short people are all right. But he's good looking. He looks different. He looks different. He acts different. He just stands out. And just like Joseph, who was separate from his brothers, David stood out amongst them all. And yet, not even Jesse looks to David at the beginning, that even thinks to bring him into the choice of Samuel. Doesn't even think about it. Leaves him up on the hill with the sheep and brings all of his sons. Sometimes our parents don't even see our potential. Sometimes our parents don't even see us for what we really are. Sometimes our parents can even look on the outward appearance. Sometimes even our family can look at us from a natural perspective. Sometimes even parents, and it's shown over and over in the Bible, can actually discriminate against their own children. And if that's you today, you've got a friend in David. But that's not what God saw. God saw the little boy's heart. At 15 years old, God saw the potential that this boy had to become the king of Israel. I have chosen myself a king. I have commanded him to be prince over my people. This little boy who's 15, young people at 15 years old, 18, 20 years old, God can see right into your heart, and he knows what you guys can become for his kingdom and for his community here, and ultimately for his son Jesus. At 15, he's looking at your heart. You know what? 15 is like the frog years. You can look kind of awkward. Proportions are not right. I get it. I understand. My proportions are still not right. But fundamentally, guys, what I'm saying is that this can be a really difficult period of life from the outside. Don't worry about that. God ain't looking for that. And anyone in here that matters also isn't looking for that either. God sees on the heart, and you know what? We should open our eyes and look on the heart too. You might just be surprised what you find. So this is God's choice. So let's turn to Psalm 89. We're going to do a few Psalms here now just to look, because we don't really get that much from kind of the secret of David's youth. I learned this one from Uncle Brian Luke sitting in his living room. Boy, I'm going to miss him. I'm sure many of you here will miss him as well. But I'm glad that for the time that I could, I got to spend some time with him. He loved David. And these next little bits come from Uncle Brian and really the legacy that he's left for many of you that are his family and people that have known him over the great many years. So Psalm chapter 89, and let's look at verse 3 first. At verse 3, it says, I have made a covenant with my chosen one, who I have sworn to David, my servant. God makes a covenant with this man, David. And look at verses 19 to 37. Now, it's a bit of a long read, but I want you to think, this is how God feels about David. This is how God looks at what he's committed to doing in David's life. Starting at verse 19. Of old, you spoke in a vision to your godly one and said, I have granted help to the one who is mighty. I have exalted one who is chosen from the people. I have found, there's that word again, I have found David, my servant. And with my holy oil, I have anointed him. And so my hand will establish with him, and my arm also shall strengthen him. The enemy shall not outwit him, the wicked shall not humble him, and I will crush his foes from before him, and I will strike down those who hate him. My faithfulness and my steadfast love shall be with him, and in my name shall his horn be exalted. I will set his hand on the sea and his right hand on the rivers, and he shall cry to me, you are my Father, my God, the rock of my salvation, and I will make him the firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. My steadfast love will I keep for him forever, and my covenant will stand firm. And I will establish his offspring forever, and his throne as the days of the heavens. And if his children forsake my law and my commandments, then I will punish their transgression with their rod and their iniquity with the stripes. But I will not remove from him my steadfast love, and I will or be false to my faithfulness. I will not violate my covenant or alter the words that went forth from my lips. Once I have sworn by my holiness, I will not lie to David. His offspring shall endure forever, his throne as long as the sun before him. Like the moon, it shall be established forever, and a faithful witness in the skies. This is what God saw of the trajectory of David's life at his anointing. God was committed that much to making this man succeed and to guiding his life and to be a providential work, to be a providential guidance in his life. And just a couple of slightly different translations, just on three small verses within this section. First, the New English Bible puts a couple of the verses like this. It's quite amazing, taking the Hebrew, the way that the Hebrew kind of bears out some of the statements, particularly right in the middle of verses 19 to 21. New English Bible puts it like this: for I have endowed a warrior with princely gifts. See the connection? I have commanded him to be prince over my people Israel. And so the youth I have chosen towers over his people. He towered over them not in physical stature. He towered over them in faith and hope and righteousness. He towered over his people. And God says, I have discovered David, my servant, and I have anointed him with my holy oil. That's how we know that God felt this way about him when he was a kid. He was a youth that was chosen. And look at God's commitment. My hand shall be ready to help him, and my arm will give him strength. The NET puts it this way. I love this. The New English translation is an amazing Bible, is an amazing commentary. If you don't have it in your library, grab a copy. I have energized a warrior. I have raised up a young man from the people, and I have discovered David, my servant. With my holy oil, I have anointed him as king, and my hand will support him, and my arm will strengthen him. This is how God felt about the little shepherd boy in the fields of Bethlehem, towering above his brothers, towering above his people, and a young man energized as a spiritual warrior for him. And what did he look like? He looked like just a shepherd boy playing the guitar. The harp, sorry. This is a picture of David. Just think about it. He's a young boy. He's out in the field, playing songs on his guitar, singing to God, stroking the sheep, carrying the lambs. Does this look like a warrior to you? But he was a spiritual warrior. And he was the one that God wanted to raise up to make him the ruler over his people. And we know that he wanted a person just like that. He wanted a shepherd boy with those exact qualities to be raised up to be his king. Let's look at what some of the other Psalms say about this. Look at Psalm 71 and verse 5. Psalm 71 verse 5 describing this. Just have a quick look at there. From verse 5. For you, O Lord, are my hope, my trust, O Lord, from my youth. Even upon you I have leaned from before my birth. You are he who took me from my mother's womb, and my praise is continually of you. Just like our Lord Jesus Christ, the greater Son of David, taught from his youth, raised, whispered in his ear, morning by morning, the principles of God, the words of God, and to his ultimate praise. From his youth. Have a look at verses 17 and 18. O God, from my youth you have taught me, and I still proclaim your wondrous deeds. Even so, to old age and gray hairs, O God, do not forsake me. For until I proclaim your might to another generation, your power to all those to come. From his youth. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come, or the years draw nigh, when you will say, I have no pleasure in them. Life gets really, really hard the older you get. You think things are complicated now? Wait till you get older. Things get really complicated. You got to make the choice like David did in his youth. He sought God in those fields of Bethlehem, and God taught him. God taught him from his youth. And David wanted to know, even to his old age, he would be doing the same thing so he can tell another generation. And that new generation is you. The new generation is you. And all those, of course, that would come. And in Psalm 27, verse 10, it's just a comparison in passing, just to mention. David says, for when my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will take me up. I don't know how many of you feel estranged from your parents, feel separate from your parents. Don't you worry about that. God has got you in the palm of his hand. He has got you just like he had David in his bundle of life. Even when you're young, even if your father and mother forsake you, the Lord will take you up. So this is a shepherd boy, but a warrior poet. We see from those Psalms, he's a shepherd, he's a musician, and he is a tough warrior. He is defending those sheep, and that was a great quality that God wanted from him. Look at Psalm 78, verses 70 to 72. And God says it in so many words. Psalm 78, 70 to 72. He chose David his servant, and he took him from the sheepfolds. From following the nursing ewes he brought him, to shepherd Jacob his people, Israel his inheritance. And with upright heart he shepherded them and guided them with his skillful hand. God chose David from the sheepfolds because he saw what he was going to be. He needed a true shepherd of his people. And very sadly, that is not what he had with Saul. You think about it. This whole lesson about the father's sheep that comes in 1 Samuel 17. Later on, David in his life, he reflects back. Remember last night I said the things that happens in his youth come out when he's older. This is one of them. When he's thinking about when he numbered Israel, he said, behold, I have sinned and I have done wickedly, but these sheep, what have they done? Please let your hand be against me and my father's house. And in Psalm 100, it says, we are his people, the sheep of his pasture. Here's a contrast to Saul. Think about David's qualities to be the leader. We have David versus Saul. David, it says multiple times, kept his father's sheep. It was right there in chapter 16. He kept his father's sheep. It comes up a number of times in the story of David and Goliath. Follow me. He kept his father's sheep. His brothers mention it. But what about Saul? Saul didn't keep nothing. He lost what he had. He lost his father's donkeys. You see how the Bible is trying to show this comparison? Both are illustrations of Israel. Sheep for good, donkeys for bad. Under Saul, Israel was a donkey. Under Israel, they were an ass of a kingdom. Under David, they were sheep of his pasture. Isn't that a powerful comparison? Just absolutely wonderful. Dennis Gillette put it this way. He said, the shepherd king of all men was preparing a boy of Bethlehem to be the shepherd king for his high destiny. What he was inwardly, therefore, is what he was outwardly. In the wilderness, as a consequence, he learned courage and cunning and patience and gentleness. He saw the invisible. In a way, he heard the inaudible. In the wilderness, God commanded him to be a captain. David didn't realize it then, but he was being made ready. The fighter, the shepherd, the psalmist, the king was being prepared by God in loneliness and danger and oppression and reflection and skillful with God in the wilderness. Is it any wonder then that David writes Psalm 23 that we sung as our opening? When do you think David wrote Psalm 23? At what time in his life do you think he wrote Psalm 23? After he finished his career as a shepherd? Probably not, but maybe. I think it's incredibly plausible that David wrote Psalm 23 on the fields of Bethlehem when he was 15 years old. They asked last night about what the first song that I wrote. I don't know, it doesn't matter. Song for Erica doesn't matter. Psalm 23 matters. He probably wrote this when he was your age. And when I was listening to you guys sing that song earlier, of just thinking about songs that are being written and composed by our community, by you guys, they could be the songs of the ages and maybe even the songs that we sing right through into the kingdom. Psalm 23. And when we think about Psalm 23, obviously we're not going to read it. You guys know it. Psalm 23 to me can be seen right in the section of David. And I think as he goes into chapter 17, really the only thing we're going to do of David and Goliath is reflect on this next video clip. And you might recognize this sound from walking past Goliath outside. To the words of David. Jonathan.
The Philistine threat continues to... The Philistine threat continues to grow. Now they have a new champion. Goliath.
Will one of you fight me? Israelites, you win. And the Philistines will be your slaves. I win. And you will be our slaves.
Someone must fight him. You, Jonathan. The warrior who defeats him will be a rich man.
Not one man in Israel. Not one of God's people.
I'll do it.
You're no soldier, you're a shepherd.
Yes, a shepherd. So I protect my sheep, God will protect me.
Where is your faith? Where is your God?
I will kill him.
Need this.
I'll be better without it. Here do I walk, in the valley of the shadow of death. Fear no evil. You are with me. Thy rod and staff, they comfort me. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life.
Israel is found and champion. Don't waste my time, little boy. You're too young to die.
I will fight you.
Shepherds called me. Save my kingdom, my shepherd. Come with me, brother.
David joins Saul's army and battles the Philistines for decades. He becomes a warrior, a leader, a hero.
And so Saul fails the royal test. And the one who's standing by listening the whole time is Jonathan. He watches his father fail to rise up and be the king Israel needed. And he watches David take his rightful place. This was a great trial not only for Saul, but also for David to rise up and to become the man that God was preparing him to be. Just going to quote something from Harry Tennant. Unlike the many occupations in the 20th century, that of being a shepherd in the chosen land gave scope for mind which wished to worship God and keep itself unspotted by the world without, and even so by the will of God brought David from the pastoral peace of the sheepfold into the world of men. And this was essential for that development of character which endued David to generations of followers of the call of God. The fact that David passed out of the quiet pastures and still waters into the tumult of wars and fightings has rendered him a companion to us all. Young people, had David remained a beautiful shepherd boy in the fields of Bethlehem, he never could have become the companion that he is now to us all. And because God brought him out of that field into our world, into the kinds of challenges that we have, he can then be a companion for us all. He never would have developed the character that he needed to become the king if he had just remained in the safe pastures of Bethlehem. No, he needed to come out of that to become a king. When you think about this, becoming a king, he had to leave the shepherd's pastures, get some life experience to be able to be ready to go into the king's courts. He had to live in the cave, experience the cross in order to wear the crown. And that is the path that we're following David on. The beautiful part about tonight is we're going to see, and I hope that that video illustrated the beautiful observation of Jonathan, watching him say that. And maybe he did recite Psalm 23 on his way up. Maybe he was saying, I am in the valley of Allah, the valley of the shadow of death, and I will fear no evil, for he is with me. And at that time, his rod and his staff did comfort him. So when we look at our Lord Jesus, as we finish this session, we look at our Lord Jesus, that is the same kind of qualities that we see in our precious Lord. Turn to John chapter 10, our reading, and we'll finish with a couple of comments there. John chapter 10. So let's look at verses 3 to 6. Now think about this, what David did and what the greater son of David is like for you and me today. John chapter 10, we'll just look at verses 3 to 6. To him the gatekeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name, and he leads them out. And when he has brought out all of his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. A stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers. And this figure of speech Jesus used with them, and they did not understand what he was saying to them. Skip down to verse 11. Jesus illustrates it now in clear words for you and for me today. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay my life down for the sheep. And you see Saul in here? He was a hired hand. He didn't care about the sheep. All Saul cared about was his own reputation. He didn't care enough about Israel and his sheep to go out on his own. He even held Jonathan back. I don't know if you saw that in the video. We'll talk about it tonight in the class. He even would have held Jonathan back. Jonathan would have gone out and taken him. He would have been held back by his father. He didn't care for the sheep. And because he didn't care for the sheep, he was like a hired hand. And that is exactly what David said. But what Jonathan said. Jonathan said to Saul, for you saw it. He took his, this is 1 Samuel 19, verse 5. For he took his life in his hand when he struck down the Philistine, and the Lord worked a great salvation, and you saw it and rejoiced. That tells me that Jonathan was there. So what we're going to look at tonight is this beautiful friendship that struck between David and Jonathan because of what he saw. And when he saw David take his own life into his hand and lay down his life for the sheep, he showed that he was the rightful king in waiting. Thank you.